stimulus, response, and the gap in between. It was Viktor Frankl who said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our own response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Life happens. Most of the time, you are not able to control or even influence many of life's events. Events over which you have very little, if any, control include things like the weather, the stock market, natural disasters like earthquakes or tornadoes, the information found on television, the internet, radio, or the thoughts, feelings, and actions of other people. Many times, you see these things happen, and without thinking, you turn on your stress response as you react to these events. In psychology, this theory is commonly known as stimulus response, or SR. It is as if something pushed your buttons, then seemingly outside of your control, without thinking, you react. We call this reaction conditioning. Conditioning occurs as we experience events throughout our lives. We've acquired and maintained certain attitudes, beliefs, or emotions toward people or things. Essentially, we're learning as we go. Some of the things we learn, we hold on to tightly, whether we realize it or not. For example, a person is abused as a young child, and now, as an adult, she's afraid of men. Consciously, she knows that most men are decent and good, but the subconscious program that's running in her subconscious mind says differently, based on the conditioning that took place when she was young. Such is the case for many of our unpleasant emotions. We get told that we're dumb, that we're not good looking, that we're different, the stimulus, and immediately we retreat, we resist, we recoil, we react, the response. And we do these things without giving a second thought to the reason why. This is so common, in fact, that few really stop to question conditioned attitudes, beliefs, or emotions. In fact, we're surprised when we see someone who doesn't retaliate with anger when something mean is done. We're surprised when someone isn't offended when a name is called. We can't believe it when someone isn't upset when his or her flight is canceled. Many people have the mistaken belief that we can't even do anything about our reactions, that we're hardwired to this SR model, that we're genetically programmed to be angry, for example. They believe that stressful things happen to us and we can't help but respond in stressful ways. No doubt you recall in your high school or college psychology course a discussion about Ivan Pavlov and his famous experiment with the dog. Ivan would introduce food, the stimulus, and immediately the dog would salivate, the response. This is an instinctive, natural response to the food, an environmental condition. Ivan then introduced a sound, a new stimulus, combined simultaneously with the introduction of the food. The dog still responded with salivation. Finally, he introduced the sound, but without the food. He found that the dog had conditioned itself to salivate to the sound because it unconsciously connected it with the food. Even when the food was not present, the dog still salivated to the sound. Since then, psychologists have done many experiments, both with animals as well as with humans, to study this phenomenon. Their conclusion? Your conditioning determines your behaviors. In other words, your conditioning runs your show. To a large extent, they're correct. Even our own experiences seem to support this belief. Imagine yourself driving in your car, minding your own business on your way to work. How would you react if you looked in your rearview mirror and noticed a police car behind you with its siren blaring and lights flashing? What would be your likely response to this situation? If you're like most people, you begin feeling anger and frustration, and you become upset that you are being pulled over. We have many patterns of behavior, called conditioned responses, that run on autopilot and don't serve us very well. When someone yells obscenities at us, we immediately get defensive, angry, and offended. When driving behind a slow driver, or when someone quickly cuts in front of us, we tend to get irritated or upset. During a class or meeting, we tend to get impatient or bored when the speaker goes overtime. The feelings we create based on our reactions to these events are conditioned or learned. They are not inherited tendencies. We don't inherit angry, bored, or easily offended genes. You are not offended because of something another person says or does. That person does not have that power. You have chosen to feel offended or to not feel offended. If you feel bored while listening to someone, you don't feel that way because of what the person is saying. You're bored because you have chosen to be bored. If you change your thoughts about the situation or change what you're thinking about during the presentation, the feeling of boredom disappears. We are not programmed at birth to respond with an automatic emotion when something happens in our environment. We have learned to respond in these ways through training and by modeling others. This is both good news and bad news. The bad news is that at some point we have all learned negative ways of reacting to specific stimuli. Unless you're aware of this conditioning and you do something to change it, you'll thoughtlessly react in the same ways that you learned. You may have never considered the possibility that you can respond to any situation in a completely different way. Most of the time, people respond to situations automatically without considering the possibility that they can actually react to it differently. Recall what I mentioned earlier. Your feelings are always preceded by your dominant thoughts. Change your dominant thoughts and you immediately change your feelings. You're always responsible for how you think, and consequently how you feel. So the good news is that if you have learned a particular response to an event, you can also unlearn it. We as conscious human beings have the capacity to take responsibility for our thoughts and immediately put ourselves in control of how any situation will affect us. It is possible to decide to not have that button pushed when something happens. You can do this when you realize that what you think is entirely up to you. It is your choice. In any situation, you have the power to choose your response to what is happening. Do you know how to unlearn what you have learned? Find out in the next video called Mind the Gap.